Hello everyone. After having looked at the HDI and understanding the GAI and its relationship to the HDI, we want to now look at some of the guiding theories of development and how those theories have maybe impacted economic policy and international policy of the United States and other countries throughout the last 100 years or so. The two theories that we're going to be looking at today are similar in some respects, but have differing viewpoints about the nature of various regions of the world. So let's get into it. The first theory we want to look at is something known as the world systems theory. The world systems theory was created by a man named Immanuel Wallerstein. And Wallerstein, in his theory, basically divides the world into three main groups. You have a group known as the core, you have a group known as the semi-periphery, and you have a group known as the periphery. And as a result of these different categories, the world systems theory is oftentimes referred to as Wallerstein's core-periphery model. And we're going to take a look at this model now so we can understand what these different groups actually look like and where they might be taking place in the world. So the core-periphery model looks essentially like this. And let's start with the smallest of the groups, and that would be the core nations. The core nations are the most highly developed countries in the world. These are countries with very high gross national income levels. They tend to be heavily industrialized, either with large secondary and large tertiary sectors. These countries are the home of the biggest international banking groups, and so they have large control over global markets in both finance as well as in trade. They have highly educated workforces, right? So that if you think about it in terms of HDI, they have high school life expectancy, and they are many people within those countries are receiving college educations. So you have a very highly skilled labor force. And along with having a high skilled labor force, they're also getting labor as well as natural resources from the periphery and semi-periphery, meaning such as you might be getting migrant workers coming in to fill high-tech jobs, or you might have migrant workers coming in to fill, primary or secondary labor type jobs, right? So there's just not enough labor in those core nations to be filled by the natural population, and so they're essentially bringing people in. And these countries dominate global economic and political situations. On the other end of the spectrum, you have the periphery nations. Now, these are the largest group of countries. These are the lowest developed countries in the world, right? The lowest income levels in terms of gross national income. They tend to be less well educated, so their skilled labor force is very small. They have more unskilled labor, right? They tend to have more primary and low-end secondary type jobs. But because these tend to be developing countries, they tend to have higher fertility and birth rates, and so they have excess population. And so they tend to export labor as well as the natural resources which they are extracting from their country to both the semi-periphery and the core nations. Also, because these countries are so low in terms of development, their banking systems and their capital systems are not really well structured, and so they tend to need a lot of outside investment to build up their industries, to build up their infrastructure, their roadways, their electric ways, their communications networks, their ports, their airports, railway, all those things they might need. They need investment from outside. And so these periphery nations get a lot of money coming in from core as well as semi-periphery nations. And in return, they're sending cheaper labor and those natural resources to the core and the semi-periphery. Now let's come to the middle, which are the semi-periphery nations, right? These are countries that are not highly developed, but they're moving along the way to becoming a much more developed country. These are your middle income level countries, right? Their gross national income is somewhere in the middle, right? They're not at the bottom like the periphery, but they're not anywhere near the core. They tend to be countries that are moving to, becoming more industrialized. They are building more secondary sector employment, right? Lots more manufacturing. You have, this would probably be maybe not the biggest, but it's a growing sector of the economy would be the manufacturing, right? Still a lot of primary, right, with agriculture and mineral extraction, but they are becoming more industrialized, and their service economy is developing as well, right? You're still going to have a small service economy, that tertiary level, but it's moving towards a bigger size of the economy. They're predominantly a capitalist, right? Where lots of investment is coming in from the core nations, but you're also starting to see the development of internal investment coming in from banks within the country and investors within the country. And so these countries are in different levels moving towards becoming a core nation. And these semi-periphery nations, are receiving money from core, but they're also receiving resources from periphery, right? Because resources from the periphery are being sent to the semi-periphery to be now turned into final goods, right? Like, for example, periphery nations might be sending, iron, right? Iron extract from the ground, sending it to semi-periphery nations to be turned into, steel, which could then be used to manufacture cars, or maybe to manufacture buildings, who knows? But that's the thing, they're manufacturing those raw materials. And so Wallerstein saw, this system of interaction between countries, right? It wasn't necessarily a progression. It was an interaction between these three, with the core nations dominating the other two and taking advantage of them. And what's interesting about the kind of this system is that, what determines a core, a semi-periphery, and a periphery is constantly changing, right? Because as maybe periphery nations begin to move up into semi-periphery, right, the metrics can change, and that could then put them back down into the periphery, right? Because the other two above them may also shift upwards, right? So it's a constantly adjusting system, all right? Kind of another visual, kind of another way to think about it is like this, right? Almost like a target, right? Where you have a small core, a slightly bigger semi-periphery, and a much bigger periphery, right? And you see the same interaction. And what you have here is something that's developed within, as a result of the Wallerstein theory, is this something called dependency theory, is that the periphery, and to a lesser extent, the semi-periphery, are now dependent upon the core for their economic growth and further development, right? Because they rely on money, investment coming from the core countries to fund their economies, to fund their infrastructure and whatnot. And the core countries extract those resources from the periphery and the semi-periphery, and that makes it so that those periphery and semi-periphery countries aren't able to use those resources for their own benefit. And so they then become dependent upon the core, right? And so this is kind of this was a theory kind of developed in the 1960s to look at why, post-colonial countries that had once been controlled by European powers, why they were not able to, develop on their own. Why were they struggling to become, economically self-sufficient? Well, the view was that they were still very dependent upon their ex-colonial powers in the more developed countries, and so therefore, the way to break that cycle was to find ways to make them more independent of the core countries. And so the debate about that continues to this day. Now, to kind of put a map on it, here's kind of a view of what, the regions, represent the different parts of the world system, right? The core is this kind of orangish color, which you can see is mostly, North America, most of Western Europe, and Japan, Australia, New Zealand. These are these highly developed countries, very high HDI, up over 900 or certainly over 850 in terms of the HDI. Then you have the semi-periphery, which is much of Eastern Europe, China, India, Latin America with Brazil and Argentina, Mexico. These are countries that certainly are progressing towards becoming more independent and core countries, right? But they still are predominantly manufacturing based economies. They are still exporting workers to other parts of the world, right? And so while they are becoming more stable on their own, right, they still are connected very much with the core. And then finally, the biggest of the group is the periphery, right, which you can see is most of Africa, parts of Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, as well as into Southwest Asia and Central Asia, right, near Iran, Afghanistan, up into Kazakhstan and Mongolia, down into Southeast Asia with Vietnam and Thailand and Indonesia. These countries are still very much primary and secondary country sector dominant, right? You have countries that are, still, again, exporting labor and resources to more periphery and semi-periphery countries. Semi-periphery and core countries, apologize for that. And, they aren't necessarily able to develop on their own. Now, things are changing. They are becoming more independent, right? But in terms of Wallerstein's theory, right, this is how the world would be organized. Now, to kind of take that to kind of a subnational level, thinking about it in terms of areas within countries that have lower levels of development compared to others, right? You could apply this core periphery model to other countries, right? Like take for Brazil. You can see Brazil, the dark green countries have the highest level of development, right? This is down near Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, down in kind of the southeast corner of the country. And projecting out from there, you can see it goes from dark green to kind of a lighter green, and then it gets very, very light as you move really into the Amazon region of the country, right? These areas are much less developed, right? So the core is the dark green, and then as you get lighter and into that lighter green and that kind of bluish color, it's more of the semi-periphery of the country, and even some of the periphery of the country, right? What those regions are predominantly in the Amazon, which you're using for natural resource extraction and farming, right? So even within countries, you can have core, semi-periphery, and periphery regions. Looking at China, right? We've seen China before. The eastern coast where the big cities and the manufacturing hubs are, right? That's the highly developed regions of the country. Whereas you go to the interior, you have more semi-periphery. And then if you move further to the west, you're moving on to the periphery of China, right? Less developed, not as much manufacturing, much more subsistence-based agriculture compared to the east, which is, very, heavily populated, very highly developed urban environment. Same thing with India, right? Southern India, the regions down in the south west portion of the country, highly developed. That's kind of their tech hub of the country, and the most wealth within the country is in that region, right? And as you get into the northern part, up in Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, you have that's where it's highly densely populated, high levels of poverty. You have the major cities, right? Or some big cities, right? You have much lower levels of development, much more squalid living conditions, right? Less educated, much more farming-based economies, right? So you have core, semi-periphery, and periphery even within countries, right? Same thing with even more highly developed countries like Germany, right? Germany, if you look at kind of the comparison east to west, right? What used to be East Germany versus West Germany, there's a very clear delineation on the map here, right? The countries that are, kind of a more reddish or purpley reddish countries, regions in the east, right? These are the areas that were part of East Germany that are still lagging behind in terms of development compared to the western part of the country. And, they're still much more rural in that part of the country. They're much, more manufacturing based, whereas the eastern part of the country is more service based, high tech and banking and finance and things like that. So you have higher levels of development in the western part of the country versus the east. We could apply the same thing to the United States, right? There are parts of the United States which are much more developed. You think about the northeastern corridor, but New York City, Philadelphia, Washington D.C. Those states and those cities are much more highly developed than, say, the rural South, where you have Mississippi and you have Alabama and Texas and Kentucky and places like that, right, less developed, right? So you could have these subnational areas that are less developed, and so therefore you have this kind of core semi-periphery and periphery regions within, countries as well. Now, the competing theory to Wallerstein's world systems is something known as Rostow's 5 stages of development. And Rostow, a guy by the name of Walt Whitman Rostow, he worked for the federal government, and he came up with this idea as kind of a counter to the ideas of communism, during the Cold War. And he viewed development as different stages. Countries go through different stages, and that unlike the core periphery, where you could, in theory, move up and back within the different stages, right? The different groupings, right? You could move from, say, periphery to semi-periphery and then back again, depending on how things shifted around you. Within Rostow's 5 stages, you are always progressing forward. You are always moving towards greater development, towards reaching the top level. And so, as we go through this, just keep that in mind, right? This is a constant progression. That there's an arc to history that is always going to be there. And so therefore, every country eventually is going to move towards this higher level of development. So Rostow's first stage is what we call the traditional stage, right? This is a very primitive stage, right? You have very limited technology, very static society. You're primarily hunter-gatherers and subsistence farmers, right? So there's not much change here, right? Government is basically, we think of, say, small councils of elders, or small groups within a society, right? Maybe groups of men within the society, right? There's not really much change, right? And so these are, the very beginnings of what human society is like, right? And there's very few existing traditional societies that exist today, right? You can think of, say, there's tribes in the Amazon that have had no contact with the outside world, essentially, right? Or you have groups like the Bushmen in Africa that have very limited contact with outside individuals, right? And so they still maintain some of that traditions, those traditional activities. But for the most part, all countries of the world have moved outside of this traditional society, and they moved into the stage known as the preconditions for takeoff. And preconditions for takeoff is when you have the commercial exploitation of agriculture and the extractive industry, right? So you have, using commercial enterprise, new technologies, tools, machinery to help with mass production of agricultural products, right? So you're increasing your food supply. And you also have now the extractive industry, meaning you're now extracting raw materials from the ground. So you could think of, say, gold mining or mining for iron, or things like you see in the picture here down the bottom, cobalt mining. So these are getting raw materials that can be used for creating income for your country, right? But what's really important about understanding preconditions for takeoff is that this is not something that's happening because of what's going on inside the country. It's happening because of an external influence. Countries outside of the region, or maybe other countries in the region, are investing money into your country, right? They are providing the means with which to build the infrastructure, the roads, the bridges, the electrical grids, the transportation systems, all of those things which you have to make a society go. That money has to come from somewhere. And so by outside countries, like, say, the United States, investing money into, a less developed country, they can help build, those systems, which will then allow you to extract the materials, or to use, get the agriculture to market to be sold to the international community, right? And so what you should do now is pause this and go check out the video on China and how China is using that influence in Africa, and how you're seeing this exact thing happen as a result of that. Okay, so watch that now, and when you come back, we'll talk about the next thing. Okay, so next stage is the takeoff stage of development, right? And this is where you start to see the development of a small manufacturing sector. And this is able to happen because during the preconditions for takeoff stage, the installation of this physical infrastructure has happened, right? You have to have this physical infrastructure in there so that you can now produce things at the factory and ship them somewhere, right? Without those roads, without those airports, without those ports, none of this is able to go anywhere, and you can't sell it. Your economy can't take in income, right? And so you start to see the creation of these manufacturing jobs, and you now have people that are able to take advantage of this, right? So you have people that are local people that are now creating these factories, that are investing in their own economies, and you're starting to see, as it says here, the emergence of a social and political elite, right? So you have people that are in power now who are starting to gain both social and economic and political power that are now able to help guide the economy, right? And so you're starting to see this economy really take off as the manufacturing sector becomes more prominent, right? So you now are shifting away from just being a primary focused economy to now a secondary economy, right? We're moving up into the higher levels. After we get through the takeoff phase, now we get into something called drive to maturity, right? So now, as a result of during this takeoff period, right, more money is being made within the economy. You're now seeing people reinvesting the money that they've made in their smaller factory situations. They're reinvesting it back into the economy to create higher level manufacturing, larger scale manufacturing, more advanced manufacturing, more highly technical manufacturing. And so you're seeing more jobs being created, more income being created within the country, and people are saving that money and reinvesting it back into their economy. And as a result of this, now you have these much more modern social, economic, and political institutions, right? You have the creation of larger banks within the country that can now reinvest money that's being deposited in those banks. You have much more stable political systems, right? More modern political systems with political parties and much more democratic political situations, right? Oftentimes because you now have a growing middle class, which is demanding a seat at the table, right? And so you start to see, much greater maturity within the economy and within the political and social structures of the country, that they are now, moving to the point where they're now going to be at the higher levels of development. And finally, the last stage of this is what we call high mass consumption, where that the country has evolved to the point where it is not just producing the things which are necessary to survive, but it's producing things that people want, right? And they're producing it in mass quantities so that people just want to buy more and more and more, right? And so we think about this, in countries like the United States, where we have essentially unlimited numbers of choices that are available to us in this country, right? And pretty much anything that we want, we could buy at pretty much any point, right? Now, there certainly are certain limits, right? Obviously, income and things like that. But for the most part, choices are unlimited to some degree. And what allows this to happen is something known as comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is when countries that are highly developed can specialize in production of certain things that they're really good at, right? They can produce certain products at a much lower cost than other countries. So countries start to specialize in particular areas, right? Like, for example, up until, up in the last few decades, China was able to specialize in low-cost manufacturing of just about anything, right? Because they had high levels of medium to highly skilled population. They had a lot of people, right? And so they could mass produce goods very, very cheaply, right? And so they could focus on, mass producing cheap goods, right? Whereas in the United States, we specialize much more in things like agricultural products. We specialize in high-tech software and things like that, right? And by focusing on those things, we can then trade with other countries like China, right? So we trade software to China in exchange for cheap toys or cheap clothing, right? And so this comparative advantage is when you specialize in areas where you can produce it at a lower cost and then trade with other countries for their goods that they produce at a lower cost. Okay, and so by doing that, everybody benefits. Everybody gets more. And when everybody gets more, everybody can increase their consumption, right? And so the highest levels of development are in this area of high mass consumption, right? So you're thinking about, United States, Canada, Western Europe, Japan, Australia. These countries have gone through, at least according to Rostow, they've gone through these 5 stages and they've reached this high mass consumption. And so this is the ultimate goal of every country, would be to achieve high mass consumption. Now, is that necessarily the best thing, right? This idea of just having unlimited amounts of stuff, is the desire for mass consumption, or the desire for these mass consumed products, is that good, right? Is it becoming too much, right? There certainly is a lot of environmental questions to this, right? Is there a lot of waste as a result? Because we can get cheap goods, are we more likely to throw something out as opposed to, fixing it or making it useful, right? Or is comparing ourselves to other people, right, and having to acquire more stuff, is that creating this kind of this image of this rat race that we'll never be able to keep up with other people, right? So, the 5 stages make a lot of sense if you think about it from the aspect of people always want to be progressing to the point where they don't have to worry about survival, right? But you then have to obviously take into account what are the costs of that, right? What are the costs of those that natural progression? So these are 2 theories that we're gonna come back to again, and we'll talk more about. But thank you for listening, and make sure we're paying attention, and if you have any questions, make sure you come back on Friday and let's talk about them and discuss. So have a great rest of your day, and I will see you guys all on Friday morning.